Good morning, everyone. How are you all? Welcome back. It looks like we've actually got technology kind of working, so we'll take it. This is all good. I hope everyone is having a wonderful Mother's Day. And so a special shout out to all the moms out there. And we will absolutely go on. First of all, it is delightful to see all of you. Hello, Carolyn. Welcome, Matt. Glad you could join us. This has been obviously a passion of mine for a long time. And so, knock on wood. Exactly. Yeah. The technology is working so far, knock on wood. So let's hope that works out. But if it doesn't, we will, as we always do, roll with the punches. But I am thrilled to see all of you. And the idea for this, I've always loved the space program. But the idea for this really was thrown into sharp relief this spring when the United States did something we hadn't done in 50 years. Hello, Mindy. Good to see you. And we actually went back to the moon, at least in the neighborhood. And that has not happened in my lifetime. And as you can tell by the gray hairs in the beard and the receding hairline, that is not recent. I've been around for a while. So what I wanted to do is take the opportunity to talk with all of you, to talk about the space program itself, how we got here, where we're going with it, really the history behind it. Because it is a fascinating, not just a saga, not just an adventure, but I think it says a lot about us as a people. Even if it wasn't always completely idealistic, it is absolutely fascinating. But I wanted to start with one of, I think, the most amazing photographs taken. So we are going to, again, let's hope the camera works. But this is going to be a photograph taken from April 6th, 2026. And this was aboard Artemis 2. This was aboard the most recent spacecraft that we have. This is the one that little over a month ago went literally further than any human beings had ever gone before. And one of the reasons this, I think, is so iconic, this is not CGI, this is actual photography, is if you think about it, we're used to, sunrise, sunset, moonrise, moonset. It's very rare we get an Earthrise and an Earthset. Hello, Sharon. Welcome in. And one of the things that is always mind-blowing to me when you look at this photo is outside of the 4 astronauts in the Artemis capsule, every human being in the world is in that photograph, all 8 billion of us, taken from a distance of over 250,000 miles from home. So far away, actually, that the radio signals to talk to the crew take about 1 1/2 seconds to reach them, and then 1 1/3 seconds for the response to get back. So this is further than any astronauts had ever gone before, and we actually have a close-up. And I hit the wrong button, as typically happens. This is why I am not an astronaut, because you don't want to hit the wrong buttons there. But this is the perfect encapsulation, because this is essentially the same photograph that was taken for the first time in 1968 by Apollo 8. The first time absolutely seeing the entire planet as a contiguous whole. And not just that, but the fact that if you look, one of the reasons this is so breathtaking is there are no borders that are visible. And in fact, all you see is our little oasis in a sea of black. And by the way, one of the reasons you can't see the stars during these daylight photos is, quite frankly, just, and if you're a photographer, you know this already, the light reflected off the Earth and the Moon just washes it all out, if you want to get a good exposure. And by the way, I will be dedicating a live stream in the near future to debunking the whole we didn't actually land on the moon conspiracy theory. So stay tuned for that. So I wanted to start by a quote. This was from the HBO miniseries From the Earth to the Moon from 1998, said by Tom Hanks. And I think it encapsulates why this is absolutely just so astounding to all of us. For most of human history, a voyage to the moon was the fantasy of the addle-minded and feeble-brained, for only divine beings and supermen could make the journey. And for most of human history, this was absolutely true. Until very recently, when we built what I assume the ancient Greeks can only imagine are mechanical flying chariots to take us there. And now you don't need to be superhuman. Here are the 4 humans who made the journey. We have here the 4 Artemis astronauts: Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen from Canada, Reed Wiseman, and Victor Glover, all of whom were able to make this journey. And so it does beg the question, how long have we been dreaming about this? I mean, surely this must be very recent. Remember, recorded history goes back 5.5-ish thousand years to ancient Sumeria. Well, the irony is we've actually been thinking about this for a very long time. One of the earliest writers to actually put down on paper this dream was a Roman writer, Lucian of Samosata, who in his work ironically titled True History, it's meant to be somewhat satire, but he actually envisions a voyage from the Earth to the moon. In 1638, over almost 400 years ago, the astronomer Johannes Kepler, living in the German states of Central Europe, for the first time actually seriously envisioned what it would take to have a voyage from the Earth to the moon, what mechanically, practically it would take. And one of my favorite writers of all time, the Frenchman Jules Verne, in 1865 wrote his seminal work From the Earth to the Moon. This was the same year the US Civil War ended. And he got it remarkably right. He was, well, not a scientist. He did interview engineers and scientists at the time and tried to envision, well, if we were actually going to do this, what would it envision? And it's a testimony to how smart Verne was to talk to these experts about how accurate he got. He envisioned, if you take a look, this sort of conical spacecraft up here, a capsule that held 3 human beings that actually, in his book, launched from Florida in North America. Ironic considering Apollo 11 lifted off from Cape Canaveral in Florida. And he also correctly envisioned that it would take about 3 days to get from the Earth to the moon, which is about as long as it takes today. And so he actually was pretty spot on about, now he was obviously got some things wrong. He's writing in the 1860s. In his vision, the astronauts are launched from a giant cannon. Any cannon with that kind of force would have essentially turned them into chunky salsa. Okay, he didn't know that at the time. He couldn't envision that the moon didn't have any air. So, he got some things wrong, but the stuff he could have actually foreseen, he actually got right. And so this has been a dream of humanity's for a very long time. The problem is the actual mechanics of getting from the Earth just into space is incredibly, incredibly difficult. So let me put it in perspective. It took 5.5 millennia to go from the beginning of recorded history to the first powered flight. The first flight of heavier than air aircraft. People had been going up in balloons since the late 1700s, but those couldn't be controlled, and those could only reach a certain altitude. So the first heavier than air flight, the Wright brothers, in 1903. So it took us a modest 55 centuries to get from the dawn of civilization to the first powered flight. It took 66 years from the first powered flight to the landing on the moon. Just 6.5 decades. That is an astoundingly compressed timeline. And it's appropriate that some of the early pioneers in the actual mechanics of how all this operates were ironically a Russian and an American. Two of them. First, the scientists Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was really the first to be the first modern aeronautical engineer to actually put this into practice. And then his American counterpart, Robert Goddard, who was the pioneer of liquid-fueled rockets, which would be required to do this. Bear in mind, up until now, we had rockets, but they were solid fuel rockets. These are essentially upscaled versions of the firecrackers we shoot off, at celebrations. Once you light a solid fuel rocket, it's lit, and it's going to go until it runs out of fuel. You can't throttle it. You can't really steer it very well. You need liquid fuels that can be throttled up, throttled down, engines that can be gimbaled so you can steer the thing. And Goddard was really the pioneer in that category. So the Russians and Americans for a long time, as well as French and Italian thinkers, had really put this into thought. But it ironically would not be until the Germans in October of 1942 that really developed the first long-range ballistic missile, liquid-fueled. Now, unfortunately, the fact that they're Germans and the fact that it happened in 1942 is going to be the giveaway here. This was the V-2 rocket, which was designed initially as a weapon of war, and this is the other side of the two-headed Janus coin about space travel. Is while on the one hand it brings out some of the absolute best and most idealistic sides of humanity, the problem is it gets its funding from, in many ways, the worst side of humanity, and that is our tendency to develop new and more innovative ways of killing each other. And unfortunately, all the scientists who as young men dreamed of voyages to space in the 1920s and 30s wound up having to develop these rockets as weapons of war, to do really the exact opposite of what is the most idealistic thing. To give you an idea of the size of this sucker, here we have a scientist to scale right here. And so, this is a very large rocket, and it was capable of moving at speeds that could not be intercepted by aircraft. And it was originally designed for the long-range bombing of London in the hopes of bombing the British out of the war. But unfortunately, a lot of the technological innovations that were needed for space travel grew out of the military and it grew out of warfare. And there's two names in particular we're going to get to know very well. Two certified mechanical geniuses that will really define the early days of this effort to even get out of Earth's orbit. And it's these two gentlemen here. On the left, you have German rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. And on the right, you have Russian rocket scientist Sergei Korolev. So These two men, vonbraun and korolev, will define the entire early part of the space race. And the similarity, these two have some great similarities, but some great differences as well. Both were very idealistic dreamers. Both were amateur engineers that eventually became experts just through trial and error. Von Braun apprenticed to aeronautical engineers in Germany at the time, including Nabel and Oberth. Korolev worked in the same circles in Russia and the Soviet Union, and both of them had dreams of exploring space. But both of their careers would be sidetracked, in many ways haunted, by two very different paths that the two men took. Von Braun, for those of you who know German culture, the prefix von is a sign of upper class status. Von Braun was not, let's face it, he didn't grow up poor. He was born into upper middle class German families. He went to great universities, snappy dresser. Korolev, by contrast, had much more humble origins. He was born essentially a peasant, but having been born before the Russian Revolution, not long before, but before. But he grew up in the Soviet Union, where a low birth was not necessarily an impediment. And during the 1920s, before Stalin comes to power, the Soviet Union was actually a very different time, provided you were apolitical. Assuming you didn't get involved in politics, the Soviet Union was a place where you could explore new ideas. Economic, social, but also technological. It was, remember, they were out to build this grand new proletarian world, and Korolev got swept up in that and designed the Soviet Union's first liquid-fueled rocket. Now, the reason these rockets are so important, you know what, I'm going to save that for a little bit. Now, both of these men obviously have these great careers going, but things go sideways in the 1930s, which, by the way, is a phrase you can use for most of world history. Things went sideways in the 1930s. The Great Depression hits. In the Soviet Union, it didn't hit them as badly because they were never integrated into the world economy, but Stalin cements power and rules as dictator. And unfortunately, what that meant, well, I'll show you what that meant for Sergei Korolev. Hello, Bug. Welcome in. I hope you're having a lovely Sunday, Mother's Day. For von Braun, it was slightly different because if you know anything about 20th century German history, in 1933, Adolf Hitler becomes Reichschancellor, essentially the leader of the German government, and within 60 days is able to consolidate absolute power. So the two men are now living under totalitarian regimes. For Werner von Braun, this meant one thing: if he wants to work on his rockets, he needs official support. But the Germany he lives in only now has one legal political party, the Nazi Party. So if you want to work on rockets, you've got to join the Nazi Party, which von Braun did. He would later defend this decision by saying, look, it was the only way I could get clearance. By the time I joined, there were no other political parties in Germany. Now, that is true. However, and by the way, you're going to learn very quickly, that's one of my favorite phrases, because so many things in history come down to however. Rockets were obviously considered a great military application. They were considered something of, not a state secret, but definitely very classified. Which means to get the clearance to work on rockets, and anyone who knew von Braun knew that this guy was an absolute genius when it came to rocket design. It's not enough just to be a party member. You have to be an elite. And that means joining the German special forces, the Schutzstaffel. You know them better as the SS. Now, von Braun would later on, and we're going to get to later on in a little bit, he would later claim that, again, is the only way he could get clearance, that he only wore the uniform a handful of times. He wasn't political. It was a career decision. Okay, fine. That said, the man was a member of the Nazi SS. This is the same group that was tasked with liquidating the undesirables from the conquered areas of Europe. These were the same people that ran the concentration camps. And von Braun's V-2 rockets were assembled using concentration camp slave labor. Now, again, he argues that he wasn't super involved, that, again, as taken from this photo, he preferred to dress in suits rather than in uniform, and that he only met Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, 4 times, and he only met Hitler twice. That said, if you have to defend your decision by saying, I only meant arguably the most evil human being in human history twice, that's not a great look. That said, it was the only way he could work on his rockets. This is going to become important much later. Actually, not that much later, but a little bit later on. So that's von Braun. What about Sergei Korolev? This photo should probably tell you everything you need to know. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev got, like so many others in the Soviet Union, swept up in Stalin's purges. Stalin was an absolutely paranoid dictator. And by the time we get to the middle of the 1930s, anyone could theoretically be swept up, arrested, and sent to the Gulag, sent to the prison camps in Central Russia for the vague crime of anti-Soviet activities. This was Stalin's way of ensuring no one could ever topple him from power. The problem is it unleashed an absolute reign of terror that can only be compared to the late French Revolution. It transformed the Soviet Union into an absolute informer state in which anybody could be suspect, anybody could be arrested, and if you were arrested, you really don't have much of a chance at acquittal. You just don't. These are show trials. And unfortunately, Korolev, like so many other innocent individuals, got caught up in it and was sentenced to 8 years hard labor in the Gulag and was sent to what is today Kazan in the modern Russian Federation, and would spend years at doing hard labor, and it had a horrible effect on his health, as you can imagine. Let's face it, prison, labor camp workers don't exactly get 5-star meals. They're subjected to horrible mental and physical abuse. And his years in a prison camp did leave him physically much weaker in terms, he had back trouble, muscle aches, as well as, not shockingly, stress-related injuries, and it weakened his heart. So the irony is that the most brilliant rocket scientist in the Soviet Union was damn near killed by his own government for, over things that he did not do. But these vague sort of thought crimes. And so obviously for von Braun and Korolev, they take very, very different paths. So what changes? What changes is the end of the Second World War. When the Second World War came to an end, everyone is scrambling to develop rocket technology. The Soviet Union really didn't have a rocket program. The Americans basically had none whatsoever. And these are the two big superpowers at the end of the war, and both of them are scrambling to try to find these V2 German rocket engineers and essentially get them to join their effort. So I'm going to head back to von Braun for a moment. The American effort was simply known as Project Paperclip. And the goal was to recruit as many of these German scientists as humanly possible. Von Braun was no idiot. He could tell months in advance, years in advance, that the German war effort was fundamentally doomed. And he, in many ways, violated orders from the Nazis. He had orders to destroy his life's work, destroy all documents, destroy the parts. He and his team actually secreted away schematics and plans and calculations in abandoned caves. And by the way, had this been discovered, the SS would have shot him in the hopes that after the war, he could continue his rocket research for the Western Allies, either the British, the French, or the Americans. And by the way, if you were a German in 1945, you knew the jig was up. It's only a question of who are you going to surrender to, and he would much, 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 much rather surrender to the Americans than to the Soviets. The German-Soviet theater had been some of the single most brutal fighting in all of recorded human history. And it was well known that the Soviets were not being gentle with the people they captured. And so von Braun and his team essentially had to dodge not just the Soviets, but their own government in an effort to get as far west as possible as Germany was collapsing in the final days of World War II and surrendered to the Americans, which he promptly did. He offered his team, he offered his technical schematics, and the Americans snapped him up. He was well known that this was the master of the German rocket program. Both the Soviets and the Americans, I just about knocked off my laptop. That was unfortunate. Both the Soviets and the Americans desperately wanted him. Now, you may be wondering, so the Americans were okay with a SS major? It was, to say the least, at the time, very, very, very controversial. And in fact, his past as a member of the Nazi Party would deeply affect and delay a lot of his work in the United States. His main defense was that his goal was to work on rockets, not weapons of war. His goal was not necessarily, he didn't care about the war, he just cared about his rockets. Now, that said, by this point, U.S. intelligence was very familiar, not just with his work, but what the Nazi regime had done. And even though the U.S. was able to recover parts for over 100 V2 rockets, these are just parts. Bear in mind, it is estimated that some 25,000 prisoners of the Nazi regime died building these V2 rockets. Ironically, von Braun's construction program killed more people than the actual V2 rockets themselves did. And this would be a major red flag for the Americans. But eventually they decided, hey, look, if we don't take them, the Soviets will. Remember, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, they weren't horrible at the end of World War II, but they clearly weren't great. The two sides did not trust one another. And so Wernher von Braun was taken to the United States, officially given residency status. But for the first several years, he and his team lived at Fort Bliss, Texas, as much to get them out of the limelight as humanly possible. But that said, the decision was deeply controversial in the United States. As for Sergei Korolev, once the Soviets realized they really, really, really needed a rocket expert, very quickly, one prominent scientist, another rocket scientist by the name of Valentin Glushko, told the Soviet state that, look, the guy you want is Korolev. The problem is right now he's rotting in a gulag. And this was going to be a little fraught on both parts. One, the Soviet state had to essentially pull Korolev out of prison, give him a pardon for something he didn't even do, on the condition he'd work on the rocket program. But the extra spice involved here involved his colleague, Valentin Glushko. Glushko, again, great scientist, great chemist. He knew rocket fuels backwards and forwards. But he and Korolev didn't see eye to eye. And the problem is, one of the people whose testimony had sent Korolev to the Gulag in the first place had been Glushko. So, oh, welcome in, fan. It's good. Hey, listen, you don't have to apologize. This will all be posted, so feel free. We're discussing the Soviet rocket genius, Sergei Korolev. So, ironically, the two top minds in the Soviet Union for their rocket program, one had, shall we say, a complicated history, and two didn't. They respected each other, but only grudgingly. They really didn't like one another. But Korolev was so brilliant that the Soviets had to essentially rehabilitate him. And so both the Americans and, oh, Amanda, thank you. And both the Americans and the Soviets took these scientists, took these captured V-2 rockets, and began reverse engineering them to make their own. And what's interesting is the Soviets actually got their version working first. Over here on the left is the Soviet R-1 rocket. This was the Soviet version of the V-2, and as you can see, it looks almost identical to the German V-2, but this is what Korolev and Glushko were able to put together without vonbraun's help. And ironically, the Americans used some of vonbraun's experience, but they really felt, and this is a technical term, icky about relying too much on a former SS guy. And so the American version looks significantly different. It was also delayed. It would launch the next year. This is the German Viking rocket. Now, neither one of these are powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity. These are basically just proving we can actually build a rocket that can go a long way. That is it. But very quickly after World War II, these two powers have now built long-range rockets. So why are rockets so important? Well, okay, we got to get into a little physics, but I promise I'm going to make it, not too bad because I'm not a physicist. The problem with gravity is everything. Gravity is the hurdle one must overcome to get into space. And you may have actually heard the term of a gravity well, which is, by the way, not a bad analogy. So if you think of the bigger an object is, the more gravity it has, the more it attracts other objects. You have to break that in order to get anywhere. Well, the problem is Earth is really, really big, and therefore it is really, really heavy, and its gravity is quite strong. So think of the Earth at the bottom of a well. The sides of the well, the bigger the object, the steeper they are, the more energy you need to jump out of that well. That is what you're trying to do. And so you need a rocket that can propel you fast enough and with enough force so that your speed balances out Earth's gravity trying to pull you back down. Neither one of these rockets can do that right now. But the goal is to get them bigger and faster. That's what the scientists want. Yeah, I know. What? I'm not a physicist. Yeah, no, I'm not that kind of a doctor. Sorry. Just history. But the reason this is so important, because nobody outside of the dreamers like von Braun and Korolev are even talking about sending somebody into space. No, that's not on anybody's radar right now. But the reason this becomes vitally important is because a rocket that can lift the equivalent of a tractor, and that's what these two rockets can do, So, several hundred pounds over hundreds, if not thousands of miles. Here's the thing. It can carry more than just a lot of weight. It can carry one of these. Remember, in 1948, the United States is the only country that possesses atomic weapons. These are the weapons that ended the Second World War in Japan. Right now, these have to be carried on aircraft. Aircraft can be shot down. Aircraft take a while to reach the target and come back. The Soviet Union and the United States are both very far away from each other. Rockets would be a way to equalize this. This is bad enough. What gets even worse is when the next year, and ironically, let me head back. In 1949, the Americans get their own rocket, but in 1949, the Soviets developed their own atomic bomb, and now there isn't just one country with nukes, there are two, which is bad enough. So there you go. And by the time we move into the early 1950s, things are even worse, because in 1952, the United States develops the hydrogen bomb, or the thermonuclear bomb, a bomb that is 10 to 20 to sometimes even 40 times more powerful than the one that destroyed Hiroshima. To give you an idea of the strength we're talking about, how big is a hydrogen bomb? It uses a atomic bomb as its fuse. That's how big these things are. And they weigh far more than these rockets can currently carry. If you're going to launch a thermonuclear bomb on top of a rocket, it needs to be able to lift about 5 tons. And right now, neither the United States nor the Soviet Union have that capability, but they desperately want that capability. And what Korolev realized is that if you can lob a 5-ton bomb several thousand miles to the other side of the planet, that'd be enough strength to lob something a bit lighter into orbit. Now, at this point, all the military they want things to carry their bombs. But Korolev, kind of like von Braun, sees the other purposes and is trying to use the military to further his exploration gains. Now, he's got the military completely on his side. Von Braun has a much more difficult task ahead of him, because even later on, bear in mind, the war has now been over for 10 years. It's 1955. The military still doesn't want to let the ex-German SS scientist anywhere near these big rockets. And von Braun was finding it very hard to drum up popular support. The US government was just not interested. And he hit on something of an interesting strategy. Now, he's obviously the gentleman here on the right. Does anyone know the name of the gentleman on the left? He is not German. He is an American. He's one of the more famous Americans to live in the 20th century, and is a seminal figure, not just in pop culture, but in particular to my lovely wife Dreams with Jam's online livelihood. That gentleman on the left is Walt Disney. What von Braun did is he came up with the idea of selling space exploration directly to the American people, and he enlisted none other than Walt Disney to help sell it. Walt Disney was a giant in American entertainment at the time, and he also was a fan of von Braun's vision. Now, this is where I have to say something a little unfortunate about Mr. Disney. He also has been rumored, and there's evidence to suggest it's more than just a rumor, that he was also a fan of the Germans, at least some of their objectives. Not all of them, but some of them during the 1930s. But to say the least, Walt Disney was a big fan of the idea of sending America into space, and he produced a number of educational videos or edutainment videos that were shown on American television in the 1950s. It made von Braun a household name, and it really sparked the interest of the American public in space exploration. Now, that said, there were plenty of people in the United States who still did not trust Wernher von Braun. The writer and popular wit, Tom Lehrer, actually wrote a song about Wernher von Braun. And so now I can't carry a note in a bucket, so I'm not going to sing it to you, but I will recite the lyrics. And you can tell me, this is sort of indicative of what we're talking about here. Gather round while I sing you of Wernher von Braun, a man whose allegiance is ruled by expedience. Don't call him a Nazi, he won't even frown. Nazi schmatzi, says Wernher von Braun. Don't say he's hypocritical, say rather he's apolitical. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun. Some have harsh words for this man of renown, but some think our attitude should be one of gratitude, like the widows and cripples in old London town, who owe their large pensions to Wernher von Braun. You too may be a big hero once you've learned to count backwards from zero. I'm German, in German oder English, I know how to count down, und I'm learning Chinese, says Wernher von Braun. So, let's face it. Most American, the average American, probably didn't know much about this, but there were plenty of people. You didn't even need to be an expert to know that von Braun, let's face it, he had a shady past. But he is lobbying, and while the American public is on board, the American military is still absolutely convinced, look, if we're going to develop a rocket, a big one, it should be American built, not basically built off the backs of German scientists. This attitude, however, will change in 1957. On the 4th of October, 1957, the Soviet Union, who had, under the leadership of Sergei Korolev, developed this rocket, the R-7. This was the first rocket that was capable of carrying a thermonuclear warhead. But to demonstrate it, Korolev, hello Weasley, welcome. Korolev had convinced the Soviet Union that a peaceful demonstration would be much more effective. Now, so what the Soviets did is they realized if they could put a satellite into orbit, be the first nation to put something artificial into permanent orbit around the Earth, that would send the signal to the military, but it would also be a scientific coup. And it would demonstrate the superiority of the Soviet system. Now, this R-7, it was a complex machine. Even with geniuses, there were failures, none of which the Soviet Union advertised. Bear in mind, one of the things that's going to characterize the space race, the Soviet Union only advertised their successes. They did not broadcast anything live. The Americans, on the other hand, we're an open society, and therefore our successes and our failures were both seen for the entire world to see. And so we didn't see the 5 test flights that failed for the R-7. But on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched this, Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Now, this thing was roughly the size of a basketball. It was a very simple device. Korolev had dreams of a much more complex device, but it was much heavier. It wasn't going to be ready in time. So they went with the simple option that quite simply was just a battery-powered radio transmitter. That was it. It did one thing and one thing only. It transmitted a beep. That's it. And you may be wondering, why is this such a big deal? Okay, so the Soviets put a big beeper up into space. Who cares? Well, here's the problem. Because it's in orbit, it was circling the Earth once every hour and a half. And there was nothing anyone could do about it, which means it was overflying the United States in North America once every 90 minutes. And yeah, it just has a transmitter, but what if it had a camera? What if it had a bomb on it? What if there was some way they could develop? You see where people's thoughts are going. Never mind, the military had already calculated they could put this thing into space, they can drop a nuke on us. And this was seen as a horrible, horrible blow in the Cold War to American pride and prestige. And von Braun did point out rather acidly that had he been to work on long-range rockets, the US would have beaten the Soviet Union. So now it was incumbent upon the United States to respond quickly. Okay, the Soviets beat us to the punch. We got to show that we were very close, that we could do the same thing. And so less than 2 months later, oh, I almost forgot about this. And while we're scrambling to develop our satellite, the Soviets trumped us again in less than a month. They launched Sputnik 2. This was the first spacecraft to have a living being on board. And it was this dog named Laika. Now, she was not any particular breed. She was honestly just a, a street mongrel from Moscow, but she became the first, I don't want to say cosmonaut, dogonaut. And the spacecraft went up. She went into orbit. They were able to read her vital signs. There was a camera in there. They could see her. And the Soviet Union transmitted to the world that little Laika had become the first living thing to go into space. Now, I don't know how much you know about this story, but suffice it to say, if you are a member of the Humane Society or PETA, you're not going to like what I have to tell you next. The problem is they could send it up. They had no way to get it back down. The official story was that after several orbits, Laika was fed a special food that put her to sleep, that peacefully euthanized her. That unfortunately is a bald-faced lie. Simple fact of the matter is, poor Laika suffered from heat exhaustion and died after 5 orbits. And so, now she's not still up there, don't worry. Remember, that was a very shallow orbit back then. I know, pour one out for poor Laika, which means after several months, Sputnik 2's orbit decayed. It re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, and poor Laika got a Viking funeral. But please know what this meant for the US. In less than 2 months, not only had the Soviets put up a satellite, they put up a second one with something alive on it. And the pressure was now huge on the United States to show that we could do the same thing. And so, in December of 1957, the United States developed this satellite, Vanguard, which, now, it was smaller than Sputnik. It was about the size of a grapefruit. But unlike Sputnik, it actually had scientific instruments on it. It could do stuff. It wasn't just a big beeper up in space. And so this was going to be our answer, that we were going to launch the satellite, and the US government still insisted on going with a competing project to von Braun's. The US Navy had been developing their long-range missile. They insisted, look, this is an all-American team. We should get the first shot. The White House agreed, and the launch date was set for December of 1957, a little more than 8 weeks after Sputnik. And so the cameras were rolling, everyone was watching, and in December of 1957, this happened. Just so you know, that's not supposed to happen. America's first satellite launch was an epic failure, The rocket lifted precisely 6 inches off the pad before exploding. Um, hey, listen, there's a reason rocket science is a synonym for very difficult. Unfortunately, this happened live before the eyes of the world. It was another absolutely humiliating defeat for the United States. Um, made a little more humiliating by the somewhat slapstick nature of what happened followed. The Vanguard satellite, bear in mind, was still up here in the nose cone. It actually got thrown clear and started transmitting data from 30 feet away on the ground, which just was even worse. The newspapers the next day had an absolute field day, just absolutely raking over the Navy over the coals. Um, it was dubbed um, Flopnik, Boomnik, and one von Braun's personal favorite, Kaputnik. Essentially, this is just an absolute embarrassing failure. And the Soviets, I can only imagine, were laughing their rear ends off. I mean, at one point, they actually threw some shade in the most petty way. They offered their condolences to the United States and offered to send the United States scientific and technical assistance from their developing nations program. Yikes. So this was absolutely unacceptable. At this point, the US government really didn't have any choice. They went to von Braun, said, okay, you got a shot in January, you can launch your satellite. And so in January 1958, the United States, 3 months later, catches up. We launch Explorer 1, our very first satellite. From a technical point of view, it was far better than Sputnik. It went into a much higher orbit than anticipated, meaning that von Braun's Jupiter rocket was much more powerful than even the Soviet R7. And Explorer 1 actually did scientific work. For the first time, it measured the Van Allen radiation belts formed by the Earth's magnetic field. And so Explorer was a success in every sense of the term, except in the PR sense. Because, yes, while it was a better satellite, the United States was still very much in second place. And there was this fear that what this was demonstrating was that the Soviets not only were ahead, but maybe their system was working better. And this is the problem in history. We have 2020 hindsight. We know in hindsight what happens, that the Soviet Union does not survive the 20th century, but that wasn't known at the time. There was this fear that this would herald the beginning of a period of Soviet dominance in world affairs. And so throughout the late 1950s, both sides now agree that, look, at this point, there's really only one thing that could trump everything else, that could one up the others, and that would be who's going to put the first human being into space. And by the way, unlike Laika, bring him back alive. And everyone knew it would be a him. And the United States realized that for the first time, we couldn't just keep piecemealing this out to different organizations. There needed to be a national effort. So by the middle of that year, in 1958, not 1958, 1958, President Eisenhower ordered the creation of the National Administration, Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. NASA is created, now it was created out of a pre-existing organization, the National Council on Aeronautics, or the NACA. But this was the first time the US had an actual official government program. Soviets had one up and running for years, but it had been housed in the military. And the goal was to come up with some sort of response. And so throughout 1958, 1959, and into 1960, the final years of Eisenhower's administration, the Soviet Union and the United States are engaged in this competition to see who could do the more amazing scientific feat. Now, this was not the goal. The unspoken goal was to put a human being, send a human being to space and bring them back. But no one wants to come out and say that, so these are sort of placeholder achievements while we develop the hardware. And so, first, the United States comes up with the world's first solar-powered satellite, first communication satellite as far as that goes. Okay, well, our first two satellites actually did stuff. Okay, great. The Soviets respond with something that once again sort of makes all the Americans go, oh, boy. They create the first probe to fly past the moon. Actually escape Earth's gravity. Go so fast it can actually break out of Earth's gravity. Later that year, the United States launches the first satellite that for the first time photographs the Earth from orbit. So for the first time, I mean, it's grainy, it's black and white. I mean, if you didn't know what you were looking at, it looks kind of like a Rorschach test. But for the first time, we can actually see the Earth from space. Then the Soviets one up us again. It's the first landing on a moon by a probe. Granted, it's not a landing you can walk away from. It's a crash landing. But for the first time, you have a probe who took photos all the way until it smacked into the lunar surface. And then a few months later, they have a probe that transmits the first pictures of the far side of the moon, the part of the moon that is always invisible to those of us on Earth. So the first time we actually saw what it looked like. Not to be outdone, the United States launches the first satellite that can actually take usable spy photographs. And the Soviets didn't appreciate that. But in late 59, the Soviets finally solved, and I hate to put it like this, the Laika problem. They sent the first living thing into space that came back alive. Two dogs, Belka and Strelka. And their puppies, two of their puppies, by the way, were sent as a goodwill gift to President Eisenhower and his family. And so we had two communist expat dogs that became Americanized. And at this point, we needed to prove that we could actually send up a living thing. Not wanting to be satisfied with dogs, we wanted something that was close to human. And so America's first astronaut was actually a chimpanzee, codenamed Ham. So Captain Ham was the first chimpanaut to go into space and to come back again, survive the journey. Thankfully, the United States didn't unalive any animals during this process. But you can see both sides creeping closer. And there was this assumption that whoever could put a person up there and bring them back might be the victor in the space race. And that would be an event that would be a seminal moment in human history. And both the United States and the Soviet Union would fall over themselves trying to be first. And Carolyn, I completely agree with you. We need justice for the puppers. But that is a story for next time. That is a story for part 2. And so right now the plan is that part 2 will be this Thursday. I'm back to Thursdays. My students have survived midterms, almost all of them. And therefore, they're all alive. Don't worry. Some just in better shape than others. But so I'm back to my Thursday morning schedule. I'm going to be putting a poll up, by the way, on the channel in which I'm going to ask what times would actually work best for you all. There's not a lot of history live streams in the mornings on a Thursday, so I'm sort of trying to claim that spot. But please let me know if the time works or another time would be better. Send any questions you have either to me on the Discord or, oh yes, part 2 is coming. This may very well be 3 to 4 parts. So there will be polls. I also have a fun announcement to make. Now that my semester is winding down and I actually have time to breathe, the History Station is going to be, how do I put this, diversifying a little bit. So yes, you can listen to history over PT, but over the summer, I will be introducing something new. I'm going to be streaming a game, specifically Civilization 6. I figured that would be good for history. And so therefore, I don't have an exact date yet, but it will be in the very not too distant future. So I will be streaming Civilization, and while I play, I will be essentially doing run-of-the-mill, off-the-cuff, somewhat colorful historical commentary. So there you go. So that's something to look forward to. So I hope you enjoy. I hope you all have a wonderful Mother's Day. I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday. Carolyn, I don't know what we'd do without you, but we love you so much. And actually, I love everyone who took the time out to join us. I hope you've enjoyed this little walk through the early days of the space race. And we are going to get into some of the human drama next time. So until then, I will see you for another little adventure through time. I hope you have an absolutely wonderful day, and I will actually see you in about 5 days. Take care, everybody.